Greetings. My name is Frederick Douglass Dixon, and I will be your host today. The name of the show is The First Amendment, Historically Speaking. We are pleased to be here today, and we're pleased that the Urbana Public Television Network is allowing us to come on and spend some very small time with you. And I can only say that I thank them deeply for allowing us to continue this particular show at this particular time. So today, I want to talk about a paradigm. Over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about paradigms and touched some very, very, very historical issues. And today will be no different. In fact, today we will want to add to our body of knowledge that we forwarded thus far. So when we begin to talk about paradigms, we're talking about ideals or things that I look to as thoughts, thought patterns. So historically speaking, we need to go for clarity to a paradigm that has reverberated to the point where we look at some actions, attitudes, behaviors, and deeds today of blacks in America. So when we begin to talk about a paradigm, one thought that has continuously caused controversy and caused what we call great debate and dialogue is called it's a letter, and it's called the Willie Lynch letter. And for those of us who have never heard of the Willie Lynch letter, the Willie Lynch letter in itself has been looked to as a source of thought that has perhaps permeated, multiplied, and festered over the long haul of American history that can probably, God willing, bring some clarity and depth to not only this show and those who are watching, but historically speaking, it can clear up or give a vantage point or give a view that looks to be very clear in how we look at some of the things that are happening today in our society. So as one would say, the farther we can look back, the further we can look ahead. So when I talk about the Willie Lynch letter, the Willie Lynch letter continues to say the Willie Lynch letter and the making of a slave. So now we want to go back to the idea of a thought pattern changing one particular group of people from human to subhuman. So that is the onset today. This is what we'll be discussing. It's called the Willie Lynch letter. Now, the Willie Lynch letter is comprised of a speech. And Mr. Willie Lynch himself was and has become very famous because of this speech. Now, there will be historians that will say that the Willie Lynch letter is in itself made up, concocted from the 1960s. Well, to challenge that thought, if it is concocted and if it is just from the 1960s, then these particular thoughts have multiplied and festered since the 1960s and are now a part of our everyday life when we think about American society. So is it indeed worthy of our time and research with humorless fervor to look at these particular thoughts? Now, Mr. Willie Lynch, in 1712, and if we're looking at our timeline, the transatlantic slave trade, 1619 to 1865, was just about 100 years old. So some of these things line up particularly. So Mr. Willie Lynch, in himself, forwarded a speech. He was considered to be an expert on the idea of controlling slaves. So now when we look directly at the transatlantic slave trade, its antennas go so far into America's fabric that the transatlantic slave trade created industries within itself. And we can just, for this small time that we have, call them sub-industries that created a means to forward a means of living for the group that was the opposite of the slave owner. So now when we talk about Mr. Willie Lynch, we talk about him coming to give and forward this speech on the banks of the James River in 1712, which means as we go continuously, this is prior to 1776, historically speaking. And what he says in the speech will be very, very cumbersome. It'll be very sobering. And what it will be, it will shed light, perhaps, for those of us who understand how long-term effects of oppression continue and they become less overt and more covert. So when he says this, he says that, gentlemen, and I'm reading this directly, I greet you here on the banks of the James River in the year of our Lord, 17,012. So as we go slowly with Mr. Willie Lynch, he's saying that he agrees in wholeheartedness that he is indeed looking to 1712 as a piece of history to be what we considered a point or a turning point in history. So now he's brought to America. He is a British slave owner who, because of his willing and dealing and finagling of slaves, has found his home in the West Indies. So he's no longer under the thumb of the king and the queen of England. He is considered to be one who is an entrepreneur, and he's also one that is looked to that in 1712 he's creating another avenue for the control of slaves. He said, first I shall thank you, the gentlemen of the colony of Virginia, for bringing me here. I am here to help you solve your problem with your slaves. Your invitation reached me on my modest plantation in the West Indies, where I experiment with some of the oldest and the newest forms and methods of control of slaves. So let us begin to understand the importance of Mr. Willie Lynch and what this time was doing. This time was saying that at this particular time, 1712, as we know, slavery has been at least legal. Well, the very first state to ratify slavery, 1641, Massachusetts. Second state, ratified slavery, 1661, Virginia. Third state, ratified slavery, 1663, Maryland. So these particular states are having problems with the idea of controlling slaves. Now, there's that runaway slave who, just because of his nature, will not allow himself to be a slave. We'll discuss the idea of runaway slaves at a different time. But the control of slaves. And he goes on to say that ancient Rome would envy us if my program is implemented. So he has a program of how to control your slaves. He says, as my boat sailed south on the James River, named for our illustrious king, whose version of the Bible we cherish, I saw enough to know that your problem is not unique. As I reverse, he goes on to, and he says, named for our illustrious king, King James, let me be very clear, and his version, ubiquitous version of the Bible. Well, when we talk about the versions of the Bible that are perhaps the most popular, King James version is perhaps the most popular version of the Bible written in English. Well, let's talk about King James. King James himself was one who controlled by fear. King James also, his version of the Bible is looked to as the particular Bible of domination. Well, I want to be very clear when we say that with Mr. Willie Lynch expressing his connection to Christianity, he's saying that as a slave owner, it is justified by Almighty God that one group be a group that will control and the other group will be a group that will be slaves. He's saying that I look to this as his connection. He says he loves, or he says he cherishes his version of the King James Bible. Now, Mr. King James himself was a drunkard. He was a homosexual. He was indeed a warmonger. So he ruled with fear. And if you understand that this particular version of the Bible was retranslated by William Shakespeare under duress. Now, these times, they all line up so very well. And he says, he goes on to say, he says that if you understand, I have a foolproof method for controlling your slaves. He said, I guarantee all of you here who are within the sound of my voice, if done correctly, you will have control of your slaves for 300 years or better. Now, if I had a chalkboard, I would walk to the chalkboard and write 1712. And then I would put 300 years that he guaranteed the control of your slaves under that. And if you add 1712 plus 300, you get the number of 2012, where only 2 years surpassed the idea of what Mr. Willie Lynch guaranteed as having control of your slaves. Now the question becomes, as we intelligently discuss this historical piece, are black folks still slaves? Are blacks in America still tied into the idea of what the vestiges of the transatlantic slave trade has done? And is this connected to our earlier term that we discussed, historiosis? Yes, indeed, the idea of 1712 plus 300 years puts us right where we are today. And he says, with the control of the slaves, he's outlined a number of differences that will indeed produce a hierarchical society within slavery, a hierarchical society within the idea of a subhuman group, a created subhuman group. He said, I've outlined some differences, but he used 3 particular means to control the slaves. He says, and I'm quoting, I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. Fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. Well, when I think about fear and what the long-lasting effects have been and what fear has been used to control the ex-slave after slavery's over in America, we look no further than lynching and the idea of the social control that lynching had. Now, lynching was always used to set the pace in a societal manner. And 9 times out of 10, when we talked about the idea of lynching, there was something that some black individual had done to violate the social control or the social normality of that particular society. So when we look historically, we look as lynching to always be tied into the purity and the sanctity of white women and the violation that black men, so-called, had attempted or so-called had put forth to create this violation of societal norms. And then he said distrust, which is a huge portion of the puzzle. Fear, distrust, and envy. Back to distrust. Distrust in all means of our society, American society, is stronger than trust. Here's my example. When we begin to talk about trust, we talk about putting a lot of our feelings and emotions on the line. So when we say distrust, I use the thought of how many people in your life do you trust? Well, the same thing goes with how many people do you have as friends. But distrust is stronger. But when we talk about trust, how many people do you trust? Can you count them on one hand? And what we mean by trust is trust explicitly. Can you count those folks on both hands? Are they very small? So if there's very small amount of people that you trust, then the larger portion of our society is tied into distrust. Fear, number 1. Distrust, number 2. Number 3, envy. This is where we talk about the mental capability and the situation of the crabs in the barrel syndrome. All of these particular thoughts have a tie to this particular thought. Now, they don't all start here because I'm sure there was fear, distrust, and envy way before Willie Lynch. But he says, I'm going to take these differences and make them larger. Fear, distrust, and envy. And when he said, with the methods that I have, I've used them for several years. And he says, I want to show you that the differences between individuals, and I want to use them in a concocted measure and manner to make them have fear, distrust, and envy among them. So he says on the top of the list is age. He said the only reason he started with age because it started with A. So to have fear, distrust, and envy amongst age, the older slave must look down and have fear, distrust, and envy for the younger slave, who should have fear, distrust, and envy for the older slave. And then he moves along to color. Now, we know scientifically that there are several shades of what we call African Americans and Africans. So when we begin to talk about what's important and what has been looked to as the desired group, the lighter the Negro, the lighter the black person, the better accepted by white American society. So he said he used color. I want to pit the dark slave against the light slave against the dark slave. And then we have those who fall in the middle, who always want to be tied more to the group that is looked to as the desired population. He says, after he goes between that, he says, distrust is stronger than trust, envy stronger than adulation, respect or admiration. So he says, I want to take the idea of the intelligence of the slave and put it against each other, pit them against each other. So the intelligent slave want to make sure that those who are less intelligent than him become more intelligent. Fear, distrust, and envy. We also want to use size, the larger, the more dominating, against those who are less or smaller. So you have the large against the small, the darker against the light, the old against the young. All of these differences prepare those for continuous fear, distrust, and envy. These black slaves, and this is a quote, receiving this indoctrination shall carry on this self-refueling, self-perpetuating hate for hundreds of years or maybe thousands. We use the idea of him guaranteeing 300 years. So he says, what's most important is pit the male against the female. I want this thought to be forwarded and that we understand that this continues today. The fear, the distrust, and the envy. And just looking at one portion of this, the male versus the female. This is where we have the most common unit of our society, the home, infiltrated. Now we have to realize that the slave master himself, who fed and housed the slaves at whatever means he fed and housed the slaves, still was the perpetrator of creating the color difference. So the lighter, meaning the more close you were to the slave master, who indeed with personal property did exactly what he wanted to with humans. So that kind of goes back, no, it goes directly back to what we talked about when we begin to talk about the third president of the United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, President Thomas Jefferson, who over a 40-year period had at least 5 children with a slave, Sally Heming. Now, the idea of creating a class of working class of people would have the darker slaves, to create those who would be what we call house slaves versus the field slaves. Here we are with a coin term. The house slave would be far lighter on the average, as a rule. The darker slave would be indeed the house slave on the rule for an average. And when we understand that he says, above all, it is necessary that the slaves trust only the slave masters, that they indeed depend on only us for every means of life, food, clothing, shelter, religion, education, lack thereof. They must love, respect, and trust only us. Gentlemen, these are our kits for your keys to control. Use them. Have your wives and children use them. Never miss an opportunity to use them. Fear, distrust, and envy. If used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. Thank you, gentlemen. And he goes on to pull off and he says, let's make a slave. It's time to make a slave. He says the business of slave owners was to master and study human nature. The slave in particular, with a view of practical results. The practical results was to have land to be tilled, homes to be built at a free rate without any return on the labor. So when we understand, he said he attained astonishing proficiency in the idea of studying human nature. This is scientific. This is indeed scientific. So he said he understood the slave nature. So the nature of the slave was to make sure that everything was tended to and to look to favor and love the slave master, the exact same person who was his oppressor. So when we look to the idea of old adages and you see the field hand and you see the slave who is the house slave and they do not get along, this is where some of those thoughts can be looked to, not as the origination, but those who have been forwarded in an infamous letter that is still here today that we can get our hands on and discuss scholarly. So when you understand wholeheartedly that this particular realm of action, which was indeed a sacrifice, he says, never miss an opportunity. So he said, you're not dealing with the idea of wood, stone, or any earth. You're dealing with the idea of actions, attitudes, and behavior. So the idea of any sober, male, strong, dark slave was indeed a cause for reaction. He was a cause for suspicion. How about this? A lot of the slaves began to read. A lot of the slaves began to read by reading the Bible. What Bible? What one? The King James Bible. So when we understand, he says it exactly, he says, every hour, if you want to have peace, you have to have these groups at each other's peace because they're awake when you sleep. And they're very dangerous. What he means by that, to have a group of folks turn into subhumans, they will eventually become subhuman. So they would take on the actions, the attitudes, and behaviors of animals. When you feed them, and lots of slaves were fed from troughs, housed in cages, and they looked to be like huts, but these were mental cages. So when he said, let's make a slave, the original and the development of a social being called the Negro, let us make a slave, what do we need? First of all, we need a black male, a black woman, and a black child. Now, that's not how this is written. He uses the N-word, which at that time was not such bad language. Today, it is looked to be as words that we no longer use. Well, at least in public, we no longer use them. But I'm wise enough to realize that a lot of those terms are passed on at the dinner table. A lot of those terms are passed on within the religious sphere. A lot of those terms have been passed on under some of the most educationally responsible fiscal as well as societal boundaries to be crossed. So if I look at it today and attempting to be one that's forwarding information to you, it would make no sense to say that this word has now gone to the pile of death. I'm quite sure that this word is alive and well. So when we say the idea of how do we do this? Well, that's called role reversal in the household. So we want to remove the power of the head of the household, which is a black man, place him in the last position, place the female in the role of the head of the household to cause confusion. So now you have the male and the female pitted against one another. So now the son or the daughter, who is that sibling or that scion of that family, begins to see the world in a different realm because they're raised in the idea of having a female as the head of a household. Now let's carry this today, 2014, as the statistics would continue to leap off the page and the research that is being done continues to back the evidence that there are far more head of households in the black community that are led by women. And he goes on to say the cardinal principles of making a Negro. He said both the Negro and the horse have to be broken for orderly progress. Pay attention to the female and the offspring as we remove the head of household and the power that comes along. So we want to pay attention to the female. The female is indeed the most valuable portion of this equation. And simply put, she's the most valuable because she will breed the next generations. So this is where we have what was called known as the stud. He will indeed make children have no connection, no social contact, no ability to raise this child, which we can turn today to how we see men African-American black males who are in the household who have been legally and systematically removed from the household and now placed in a position that's other than the natural position of head of household. We can look legally and systematically to what we call AFDC. AFDC was a government-sponsored program. And what AFDC really did was it removed the idea of the man being the head of the household and replaced it with a monthly stipend. Now, AFDC was a government program, and we're tying these things back and forth, but they all tied to the idea of the removal of the original head of household and the responsibilities. He said the idea of neither principle alone will be suffice. So they have to make sure that the peculiar needs of this woman are now looked to as the head of a household, so she's in a reversed position, isolated and in front of the household, and becomes one who has content for her male counterpart. You see that today in the actions, the attitudes, and behaviors of black people all over the world. These are very concrete structures. These are legally, systematically, institutionally still alive and well today. And he says we must make sure that we concentrate on future generations. Keep the mind at bay. Keep the mind in a always suspicious manner and make the body strong. So when the young lady who is the head of the household raises a son, in order for her to teach her son to not have problems with the overseer, to not have problems with the slave master, she teaches him to be mentally weak and physically strong. How do we tie that today? Well, we can go back no further than what we look to when we see how every idea when we talk about the furtherance of the family unit goes around this particular issue. What's happening in the household? What has been the largest portion of what happens in the household? The process of breaking the African woman is the most important portion of this particular picture. So she is to be broken as a horse is broken. Neither a horse nor a natural Negro woman will do as a slave. So they have to be removed, both broken for orderly progress. Now, this particular letter holds so much value. And those of us, we are trying to forward vision to you why you see so many homes that are ahead of the household 300 years later. How much that we find that some groups do not have the capacity to proclivity to get along with each other inside of the household. We can all take these particular thoughts from this particular paper. Now, for those of us who don't understand its importance, the Willie Lynch letter has been infamous for years. What I can explain to you is you do see the vestiges of the transatlantic slave trade. You also see the vestiges of the pitting of one against another, because it's not natural to not get along with people who look like you. There has to be a process that takes place for you to look to someone who looks just like you with hate. This is just one small thought about how important the idea of what history means, how we can break it down scholarly, how we can forward esoteric information under the idea of historiosis, which will indeed cover the idea of black studies versus the study of blacks. Today was a lesson on black studies. The study of blacks will tell you that Willie Lynch letter did not exist. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for all your time. And this information may in no means change your mind, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, Frederick Douglass Dixon, a distinguished man of color. Thank you.